Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Chris Schrader. I'm the Director of Global Marketing at Natural Capital Partners here with Jonathan Shopley. I have to say I'm based in Washington, D.C., and I'm here where it's a nice sunny 4 degrees, 23 degrees Celsius. So I've got a little bit of sunshine here coming in, but I hope you'll forgive that. Jonathan Shopley is based in London. Hello, Jonathan. Thank you for joining us. So we're here to talk about the complexity of climate change and how the landscape of climate action has been changing for businesses as a result of a number of different factors. And Jonathan is going to be going into that in just a moment. Before we get started, I just want to share a couple of housekeeping items with you. This webinar is 45 minutes. The first 30 minutes will be presentation from Jonathan, and then the last 15 minutes we're saving for chat and discussion and Q&A. You're all on mute, so that will all be happening in the chat and questions box. So please, throughout the session, feel free to enter any questions or comments that you have, and we'll be sure to address those. And with that, Jonathan, I will hand it over to you to kick us off.
Thanks, Chris. Nice to see the sunbeams bouncing off you there in DC. I can tell you that it's a very stormy, windy, rainy day down here in the south of England. But I'm, like you, thrilled to be here this afternoon, and thank you for joining, all of you for joining. Next slide, please. Chris, you sort of introduced this whole topic as being, focused on the complexities of climate change, but, what we know from our experience is that for corporates, there is plenty of complexity, and what we're looking for here are simple ways to take action. And so, excuse me, this year we've started off a series of articles to sort of continue our climate calculus articles of last year, and we've, excuse me, subtitled that Simplifying the Complexity of Climate Change. So what I wanted to do was just to start off and explain why it's difficult actually to simplify the complexity, because everything is related and connected to everything else. But to help simplify that out, I'm just using this diagram here to talk about the fact that there are risks associated with climate action. The integrity of voluntary action in particular is receiving some analysis, some scrutiny. For example, the Environmental Defense Fund ran a program on mobilizing voluntary action, looking at the interactions and the risks of taking voluntary action removed from the Paris Agreement or the architecture of the Paris Agreement. The gold standard is currently out of consultation on a similar topics, and Trove Research has been funded by the Children's Investment Fund Foundation to also explore how we get from where we are now to a de-risked voluntary action landscape, given all the uncertainties. Then, the other thing that's come to the fore, particularly in the hiatus left by the postponed COP26 from last year, is that we have the Paris Agreement very front and center in terms of what we're trying to do and achieve as a global community. But during that hiatus, we've been left in some uncertainty as to how the Paris Agreement will be implemented. And in the meantime, actually, the science as presented to us by the IPCC and others have really provided a sort of a real North Star for what we need to do and what we need both compliance and voluntary action to, in concert, deliver. And this has been explored and actually codified in some way by WWF through its Blueprint for Corporate Voluntary Action. The Science Based Target Initiative has set out a consultation on net zero standards, on a net zero standard. And following from the Trove Research, the High Ambition Demand Accelerator, another initiative, is going to look at grounding both voluntary action and compliance action more firmly in the science, given the urgency that we feel as we approach the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, beyond which we know we shouldn't go, but we might well do, and then cause global warming average temperatures to increase by more than 1.5 degrees. The final vertex here is commitments. These are related to aligning with Paris or taking commitments to net zero, commitments to carbon neutrality, and work done by the Oxford University on offsetting principle has helped us understand, relating back to the science, how important it is to shift and expand our focus from removals, avoiding emissions, to actually removing them from the atmosphere. And the SBTI net zero standard focuses on that quite a lot. Next slide, please. So, in order to take that rather complex interplay of just 3 of the dimensions that I've mentioned on the left-hand side, the questions that I intend to address in the webinar today are those in the blue box on the right. Is neutral, carbon neutral, or climate neutral the same as net zero? Where does climate positive fit in? How does abatement, reductions within our businesses, within our scope of influence, relate to offsetting? Are all carbon credits the same? And what's the difference between reductions and removals? How does voluntary action actually relate to the Paris Agreement? And then final question, how do corporates get rewarded for voluntary action? Because voluntary action, after all, is not driven by compliance. It's driven by corporate proactive action on climate. So those are the questions that I have in mind. And Chris, I'm going to pass back to you because I know we're going to put this out as a poll as to which of these are most important. Back to you then.
Okay, great. Yes, so if you take a look at these questions, moving on to the next slide, you'll see that we've prepared a poll. We wanted to put these questions out to all of you and ask you which are the most pressing from your perspective or from your business interests. Is net zero the same as neutral, the same as net zero? How does abatement relate to offsetting? What's the difference between reductions and removals? How does voluntary action relate to the Paris Agreement? How do corporates get rewarded for voluntary action? Please select any of these and all of these questions that apply that are of high interest to you. And we'll give it a moment to let the results come in. Okay, let's see. Okay, so it looks like there's all of these questions rise to the top and are significant to people. Looks like how abatement relates to offsetting is a key issue, and also voluntary action related to the Paris Agreement. So with that in mind, I'll hand it back over. Yes, Jonathan, what were you going to say?
No, thanks, Chris. And one of the things we should invite people to do is, if there is something that really is top of mind that wasn't on this list, please put it in the chat function so that we can focus on that maybe in the Q&A or at a future session. Thanks, Chris. That's
yes.
Kind. Should we go to the next slide? Good. So if I had the opportunity, I'd reorder these in terms of the results of the poll, but I think all of the items got some votes. So I'm just going to kick off in the order in which I presented them and talk about carbon neutral and net zero. And one of the issues, one of the complexities at the moment, I guess, is that carbon neutral has been around for a while. Net zero is a real important interpretation of the science and the need to get our global economy to net zero. And at the moment, there aren't really any very well established independent standards like those within ISO or science-based targets. We at Natural Capital Partners have operated the carbon neutral protocol for about 20 years, and obviously we have some experience, and we've evolved that to reflect the changing landscape. But it's wonderful to know that ISO is just embarking on I think they're 6 months or maybe 9 months into the development of an ISO standard for carbon neutrality. As I've mentioned, Science-Based Targets is consulting on a net zero standard, and indeed that may in time find its way into an ISO standard as well. But the complexity here is that in the minds of consumers and the wider population, carbon neutral and net zero are often conflated or confused. And, so what do we do about that? Do we shut one down and focus on net zero, or do we allow and encourage greater definition of these two concepts? Next slide, please. So coming up, on the right-hand side here is our view on these issues, on the question about neutral and net zero. Neutrality, in our view, is about immediate action to fully compensate for unabated emissions. And when an organization purchases carbon credits, there's a direct flow of funding to a mitigation outcome. Net zero is a target to fully neutralize climate warming impacts by a certain date by an organization. And by the way, neutrality can be focused on an activity, a product, a service, an entity, or an activity. Net zero tends to apply to a corporate, an entity, an organization. Now, when you compare and contrast what net zero does, which is to set a target at which point all of the emissions would be balanced out by removals in order to get no net impact on global warming, we can see that these two really are different. Neutrality and net zero are pretty complementary and powerful when combined, but both need greater definition and transparency and precision in the application, which is why it's great that the Science-Based Target is consulting on this, that ISO is developing independent standards in that area, which will make these more applicable, better understood, and more widely applied. Next slide, please. So the next piece, and I noticed this got quite a few votes in the poll. How does abatement relate to offsetting? And my thanks to Science-Based Target Initiative in their consultation document on the net zero standard of guidance to corporates. They have this diagram, which I think is a very useful one, and I've actually seen it used quite widely. So above the x-axis in the middle there is a emissions trajectory. And of course, we all know that Science-Based Target Initiative is all about making sure that no matter what an organization does externally, its internal focus on abating its emissions really should follow a science-based trajectory, so that inevitably when all organizations around the world have abated their emissions, we get to a safe level of greenhouse gas concentrations. Now, what they've done, of course, is recognize that along that pathway from the left to the right, to getting to a 1.5 aligned mitigation pathway, for example, along the way, organizations are still going to be emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And the gray zone behind the below the x-axis, it talks about optional compensation, which is what we call carbon neutrality. In other words, as you go, all of your unabated emissions are compensated for through the purchase and retirement of high quality carbon credits. Now, the issue about compensation is, it can be communicated either as neutrality or as is being proposed by the Science-Based Target Initiative and also the gold standard, that it could also, and perhaps in their view, be less confusing if carbon neutrality was replaced by a contribution in support of national reduction targets. And those national reduction targets are what people commonly call NDCs, nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement. So there's no confusion that a corporate is funding an emission reduction that may be used or claimed by a nation when it is reporting its against its NDCs to the UNFCCC. Next slide, please. So our comments on this, our view to help simplify these two concepts of abatement and offsetting. Internal abatement means decarbonizing an organization, an activity, a person's emissions. Offsetting means financing additional reductions equal to unabated emissions. Together, they drive the transition to net zero. So the internal, the abatement activities of this hypothetical organization on the left is definitely making progress over a period of time to reaching a 1.5 aligned mitigation pathway. The optional compensation, the carbon neutrality, combined with that commitment to abatement, really speeds up the transition and secures, underpins, and guarantees to a point the target of net zero along that pathway. One thing I want to mention before we leave this slide, the purple carbon removals, Science-Based Target Initiative, and the science suggests that when we get to the point where we've delivered, an organization has delivered a science-based target, got to that point, there will still be some residual unabatable emissions. And in order to respect the science, those emissions need to be removed or neutralized with an equal and opposite removal activity. Now, removals are carbon credits that remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere in a meaningful way. And that will take me to my next slide. So now just a brief commentary on the difference, the essential difference between reductions and removals. And I know this is an entirely busy slide, but I want to thank Oxford University for the work that they've done on this taxonomy of carbon offsets and indicating that emission reductions and carbon removals are different in terms of their impact on atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases. And without going into any detail on the detail on the slide, I just want to say that emission reductions tend to avoid. Actually, if you can show the next slide for a moment. Thank you. Emission reductions reduce greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere. Carbon removals remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. Both types of carbon credits are available, are definitely needed, and they're definitely needed from existing and new projects if we're really going to move the needle on reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, both by avoiding in the first place or reducing emissions and removing those that are already in the atmosphere. Now, at the moment, removals, which are clearly needed to complete the net zero equation, are in short supply. They tend to be either nature-based or engineering-based. Nature-based are through sequestration in biological systems. Forests or soil carbon takes quite a long time to establish its sequestration, its full sequestration potential. And engineered solutions, which are direct air capture and removal of carbon, the technologies are in early stages and rather expensive. So it's very important for us to understand the importance of all kinds of removals and reductions, but we will need to show demand for more projects on the removal side to make sure we build that capacity. Next slide, please. So this one, and I'm sure those in the audience will have come across, the vexed and the complexities, vexed issues and complexities around the interrelationship between the Paris Agreement, which sets a sort of uber compliance regime over all nations, but doesn't include corporates. Corporates, of course, participate and contribute to national emissions. So there's been a lot of debate about how voluntary action relates to the Paris Agreement. What we want, of course, is a world where voluntary action complements, speeds up, deepens all of the ambitions of the Paris Agreement. And certainly what we don't want is a situation where voluntary action somehow or another weakens the ambition of countries, for example, that host mitigation projects. So there have been two important pieces of work in this area and more to come. Environmental Defense Fund published its mobilization of the voluntary carbon market report, which looked at the interaction between voluntary regimes and the compliance regimes. And here's just an extract of their summary findings. Urgent action should not be delayed. Voluntary action should continue. And that should continue to invest in high quality carbon credits through voluntary carbon markets and support robust activities that reduce and avoid emissions and enhance removals and facilitate countries in achieving nationally determined contributions. The gold standard for its part is consulting at the moment on how it prepares its standard for a situation where if the NDCs are fully implemented, it may require voluntary action to interact more closely with nation states to make sure that the mitigations being funded by private sector entities, for example, or the voluntary market, are not in any way used to reduce ambition within the Paris architecture. Next slide, please. So as far as the way we see this is that corporate accounting is separate to Paris accounting, and voluntary action within nation states and across nation states, if you think about multinational corporates with footprints in many countries, voluntary action really helps countries achieve their targets. Not the countries in which those corporates are headquartered, but the countries in which their mitigation projects that they are funding are based, because any reductions there are held or not exported to the corporate. They're held in that country and go towards its NDCs and inventories. So the question that we're debating and the complexity that's being plumbed here is, do claims of neutrality have the risk or provide the risks, for example, of masking an increase of emissions? So if corporate A claims neutrality, invests in carbon credits, retires those, but actually what it's doing is, through its claim of neutrality, communicating a sense that it is not a problem for the climate, but in reality, its emissions may, behind the carbon neutral claim, actually be increasing year on year, and therefore contributing additional greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. So that's a risk that we really want to contain, which is where science-based targets focus on abatement as a complement to offsetting is very important. The other question that brings complexity here is, does voluntary action in any way disincentivize countries from raising their ambition? And at this stage, where the Paris Agreement hasn't been fully translated into its operating modes, and all the rules and operational dimensions haven't been filled out and agreed because of the delay of the last conference climate summit to November this year in Glasgow. There is a concern that until we get those rules and modalities in place, it becomes difficult to adjudicate whether projects are indeed additional, or whether they in some way might be encroaching on or displacing ambition within a country to raise its own ambition through its NDC. So these are the issues that are very much being debated in the market at the moment. Next slide. Thanks. So I noticed that this particular question, how do businesses get rewarded for voluntary action, didn't receive as many votes as the others, which is probably reassuring that corporates feel very comfortable about how they extract value. But I just wanted to reference this WWF report done in partnership with BCG. It's guidance on corporate action beyond science-based targets. And there are many of the steps here that we'll understand, the accounting and disclosure, the reducing in value chains, and then within this particular model, quantifying the financial commitment by pricing remaining emissions. Now, under normal, carbon neutrality programs, the pricing is often derived from the market. In other words, the price of the offsets that are purchased. But in this instance, WWF is suggesting that the unabated footprint multiplied by a price of carbon, not set by markets, as yet undefined as how it might do that, would create a sum of money that a corporate would have available, would make available to its responses to its climate impacts. And that might be further emission reductions within its boundaries, unlocking climate solutions by funding, through funding of mitigation projects, through offsetting, neutrality, quality carbon credits, that provide mitigation outcomes or in fact removals. So the financial commitment based on the footprint is then diverted into a number of activities that deliver value in different ways. Next slide, please. So voluntary action, in our view, really thrives when it delivers business value. And claims, whether that be claims of carbon neutrality or pledges that are backed up or verified that support claims of net zero or being on a path to net zero, are very important in extracting value by a business amongst its key stakeholders, customers, supply chain partners, investors. But having said that, the complete approach, or the sort of more expanded approach set out here by WWF, is very supportive of coherent climate strategies that really build enterprise value by investing in not just carbon neutrality, not just net zero, but innovations or opportunities to reshape business models so that the enterprise value of those corporates and its resilience, their resilience in a carbon constrained world, is protected and enhanced. So in our view, we need to make sure that corporates have access to all of the levers that help generate tactical and tactical value as we go, that appeal to audiences immediately, as well as strategic value over the longer term. Next slide, please.
Jonathan, do you mind if I step in with a question that we got from someone in the process, which I think has been relevant throughout the discussion? This question is, what are the leading classes of carbon offsets now available to corporates beyond tree planting? And I think I might add on to that specifically around removals. I think that might be a good part of it.
So, Chris, is that just to understand that question correctly? So, classes of mitigation. So, there could be. Is it specifically around removals, Chris, or do you think it's just all classes of mitigation?
Well, I think it's going back to the tree that you were showing, the hierarchy of.
Okay. So reductions are typically preventing emissions to the atmosphere. So there might be energy efficiency, clean cook stoves, more efficient processes. It could be a switch from fossil fuel power to renewable energy. Those are classically the sort of avoid and reduce categories that are available in some volume in the market at the moment. Then when you go to the removal side, there are geological, engineered, and natural climate solutions. And the natural climate solutions generally break out into afforestation or improved forest management, and indeed, in some cases, even forest protection projects, REDD projects, protecting rainforests. Those rainforests are sequestering carbon as they go. Those are typically the nature-based solutions. The engineered solutions are any mechanical mechanisms of sucking greenhouse gases, whether that be methane, whether that be carbon dioxide, out of the atmosphere, and then permanently removing them. And the permanency of those is a bit of a question, because nature-based solutions can obviously release carbon if forests are burned down, etc. By the way, the other category I should have mentioned in there is soil carbon. So restoring the soil carbon in depleted agricultural lands, for example, is a great way to sequester carbon. But obviously, when you're making a claim against the sequestration or the removal of those, of carbon neutrality or net zero, we need to make sure that the permanence of those is secured. And that's why some of the engineered solutions, where you capture the carbon, perhaps bury it, sequester it in deep aquifers, use it in some mechanism, store it up in concrete, for example. The permanence of the engineered solutions may be easier to protect, but those are the ones which are yet to be commercialized at scale and yet to be affordable. Chris, does that answer the question?
Great. Yeah, I think it does. We can move on, and I just wanted to use this as a chance to
Thank you.
let people know. Please feel free to submit any questions or chats, and we will be getting to those.
Great. Yeah, good, Chris. Next slide, please, because I'm very close to our end. So, this question about how businesses optimize returns from voluntary action. As I pointed out earlier, neutrality, back 20 years ago was the tactic, the strategy. It's now been complemented with net zero. And as I've mentioned as well, there are also opportunities for corporates to make a contribution to mitigation, adaptation for that matter, without using markets or instruments, and by funding innovation, further abatement, new technologies. And there are also combinations. You can be carbon neutral today with a net zero commitment over a period of time to 2030 or 2050. There are contributions that could be made. Example, Microsoft has made a pledge to neutralize its legacy emissions to the atmosphere since it was formed in 1972. That could be in the form of a contribution that reflects both the tons that were emitted into the atmosphere that's still likely to be around, multiplied by a price that might be considered a fair price. And that could be invested in any kinds of activities that deliver a positive climate impact. But the purpose of this, one of the purposes of this, this webinar is to hear from this audience, really, where you or your corporates that you represent see the most value. Is it in neutrality, which is really, and I'll just read out how I might describe these, because I'm going to ask you in our next poll to highlight, the individual interventions or responses or combinations that you think work best for you. So neutrality is very much about measuring your footprint, abating your internal abatement, combining it with that, and then neutralizing, compensating for all of the unabated emissions with instruments. So that that's a voluntary action. The view of many corporates is that shouldn't be tied to national or international climate regimes, that a neutrality claim is favored because it is recognized in the market. It's been around for a while. People understand what it is. And these organizations may not be ready or may not be of a shape, size, and form to take on a science-based or a net zero target at this stage. And when we get to net zero, a corporate might say, we think net zero is the way to go because we want to put our complete focus on internal abatement, and we want to transform our business. We do not compensate unabated emissions along the way, and that's to ensure that all of our resources are focused on our low carbon transition. We'll deal with any residual emissions through removals, the retirement of removal credits, when we get to our net zero target date. And then, of course, the contribution approach is for those organizations where contribution claims are seen to give more flexibility of setting the price of carbon that you'll apply to yourself, to your footprint. Those organizations may have abatement targets, but are not ready or able to commit to a science-based target or a net zero target. And voluntary action is important to them, but they also believe that that voluntary action should be very tightly tied and effective in helping nation states, and the international response under the Paris Agreement is really what matters, not voluntary action. So they want to align very, very closely with national commitments. So compensation approach helps countries meet and potentially exceed their national targets. Now, of course, we can combine neutrality and net zero. I've made the point that we see them as different and complementary. So neutrality today combined with net zero future commitments demonstrates action today and a pledge and a commitment to be net zero in the future. Customers recognize and can differentiate on the point of neutrality and can trust, and investors can get, will respect the commitments and value the commitments to net zero over time. And of course, similarly, number 4, there is an opportunity to combine net zero and the contribution approach. Contributions and neutrality are mutually exclusive because both of them work off a footprint, but the contribution is less tied to a price of carbon, less tied to the shape of the intervention. So, net zero plus contribution gives a little more flexibility to the contribution commitments, and is for those companies who believe that a license to operate in a particular country may favor contributions rather than a neutrality in combination with its net zero approach. So, Chris, that's hopefully a reasonable, setting out of the 3 broad options and then the 2 overlapping combinations, and sets you up for your next poll.
Great. And before we go to that, Jonathan, thank you. I just wanted to raise something, that we had talked about offline before this webinar session. I thought maybe you could address it here before we move on to our poll. Neutrality and contribution, or kind of the all of the above approach. What's your perspective on how those all fit together? Yeah. Can you do all of it?
Yeah, I think that generally a contribution and a neutrality claim are sort of, I said it a moment ago, sort of mutually exclusive, because neutrality uses instruments, contributions uses another approach to effectively neutralize the footprint. But I do believe that there are companies that can combine all of these, all of the above, neutrality, net zero, and contribution. So, for example, the Microsoft, if you're going to do a legacy contribution to compensate for historic emissions, that might be a contribution, bring that into the picture as well.
Great. Okay.
Back to you.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. So with that, we have just one second poll, and then we will get to the questions. So again, I've seen a few questions coming in. Please feel free to submit your own as the conversation continues. For the closing poll, we wanted to ask, based on what you just saw, which approach is most applicable to your business? More of a neutrality approach, looking at neutrality and net zero, looking at net zero and contributions, or a pure contribution approach? And once we get some submissions in, we'll show the results. Okay. So Jonathan, let me ask you, looking at this, in your experience so far, how does this line up with what you've seen? It looks like there's a lot of interest in net zero and contribution approaches, as well as neutrality and net zero. So really looking at where different approaches intersect.
Yeah. So I guess my take on this is that organizations favor the immediate response and financing of compensating mechanisms, but the importance, the science inspired importance of making sure that puts all of us, individual organizations and collectively, onto a path of net zero is critical. That's 70% of this poll sort of is committed to that, either net zero and a contribution or net zero and neutrality. So that's very helpful. And Chris, there is one more slide after this, which I can quickly use to sum up. Great. Or we can go straight to questions. But maybe I'll very quickly do, reflecting on the poll. Let's say that neutrality and net zero are different and complementary, and I think the poll supports that actually. Abatement and offsetting are complementary and necessary. So the fact that contributions and carbon neutrality play a role and are recognized to do that, speaks to that complementarity again. Carbon credits from removal projects, must become, we didn't do a vote on this, but, our point is that it is absolutely essential that we get our arms around removals and voluntary action, either through contributions or neutrality, a terrific way of signaling a demand for that removals. Voluntary action has an increasingly critical role to play in delivering the ambitions of the Paris Agreement. So finding a comfortable accommodation which doesn't risk undermining the integrity of either net zero, carbon neutrality, or contributions is critical. And in order for these concepts to really grow and scale and deliver impact, we do need to have commonly accepted and understood definitions of what they are. So I'll stop there, Chris, and hopefully we've got a little time for a question or two.
Great. Okay. Yes. So there are a couple questions coming in. One, it says, as an international company, should we compensate our emissions directly in the countries these emissions occur, or should we scale our compensation centrally?
Yeah, Chris, I think that I wish I had a little bit more time to unpack the strategic value of taking action, but I think it's every corporate's responsibility to sort of figure out where they get the best return. Mm-hmm. So, a contribution to a country's mitigation or adaptation may be a wonderful way for an organization to get a license to operate within that country. So for example, tech companies with data centers around the world, which are having a big impact on energy usage in those countries, may want to provide its contribution or seat its carbon mitigation projects in those countries where they can bring most benefit to communities, forests, whatever is going on there. On the other hand, you can concentrate your contributions in domestic programs within either your headquartered country or other countries in which you operate to bring scale to a particular intervention that's important to you. So, if you spread your portfolio around different interventions, contributions, you spread your risk and your rewards for doing that. If you concentrate them, you get scale. So you just have to weigh these up. And I think it really depends on the corporate's business strategy as to what kind of compensation or climate strategy they apply to maximize that.
Great. Okay. Just came in, I think this might refer back to the previous slide around removals as part of the summary. Are reductions and removals mutually exclusive?
Within a portfolio, within a portfolio of instruments, what we showed is that within the science, the net zero target as set out by the science-based target, that you have to have removals for the unabated emissions when you reach your net zero target. So you can't use avoidance or reductions, you have to use removals. During the compensation phase, to get to that point, all reductions and removals can be used interchangeably. So my sense is what makes a way of tackling that is to have a portfolio of offsetting instruments and seek to move those more and more in the direction of removals over time.
Okay, thanks. Actually, a few questions just came in here in the last few minutes, and I know we've really only got 1 minute, so I just want to allow for one more question. And then we can follow up by email to any of the other questions. So we will be sure to get back to you. This one is, what do you see as the future of high quality offsets in the years to come once we hopefully reach net zero? Will they still have a significant relevance?
So let's, if you take the Paris Agreement, and as every nation state sets meaningful targets that are economy-wide and in absolute terms, the role of offsetting and driving the initial phases of the transition will taper off over time. We can't offset our way to a climate solution. We need to abate our way to that. But in the next 10 years, given the urgency and the gap, the widening gap between where we are and where we should be, all of these solutions, neutrality, net zero, avoidance, reductions, removals, have a role to play. But over time, they will become less and less. And certainly by 2050, as set out by the IPCC and recited in the Paris Agreement, we should really have removals and emissions in balance for a net zero global economy.
All right, well, thank you. Well, we are at time, so I just wanted to acknowledge that and just be respectful of other people's time. Like I say, we did get some other questions. Unfortunately, we did not get a chance to get to them on this call, but we will follow up with you directly afterwards. Just to close out, just wanted to say thank you. For further reading, as Jonathan mentioned, we have he's kicked off a series on simplifying climate complexity, making net zero meaningful for business. That's currently available on naturalcapitalpartners.com in our news and resources section. And feel free to get in touch with Jonathan or myself directly. Both of our emails are here. And then also please remember to follow us on social media if you don't already. We send out emails about the upcoming events, but we also post quite a bit on social media as things are happening to keep people informed. So with that, I want to thank all of you for taking the time today to meet with us, and hope you have a great rest of your day and great rest of your week.
And I'll add my thanks and goodbyes to that too, Chris. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you.